Hi class, so continuing on in the 2.3-2.4 PowerPoint, we need to focus on section 2.4, which is titled Summarizing Categorical Distributions. So within this section, we're going to look at mode and variability for categorical variables, and also how to describe categorical distributions. So when you're describing a categorical distribution, right, one thing we want to recall is previously we looked at describing a numerical distribution, and in order to do so, right, the three things of focus were to record the shape, the center, and the spread, right? But if we think about these three things a little bit, what those three things are dependent on or important is that there has to be some type of order in our variables, right? So when we looked at numerical variables, right, for example, we create a histogram, and remember one of the big differences between histograms and a bar chart, right, which we use a bar chart typically for categorical variables. So a bar chart, we can move the categories around, right? There's no apparent order. But when we're dealing with numerical data and make a histogram, the order is important, right? Because our horizontal axis in in a numerical data set, right, is going to be a number line, or in a categorical data set, right, like a bar chart, we just list the categories, right? So you can refer to previous videos that I've done, or the textbook to visualize that. Right, if you're having trouble recalling what those two things were. So so I made a note here. So since categorical data has no inherent order, these measures do not make sense for categorical data. Right, so that's what I was trying to explain. Right, so since we can just swap things around, it doesn't make sense, for example, to talk about shape, right? Because we could just keep making different shapes with the same bar chart, and it would still be correct, right? I can just keep swapping bars around. So that clearly doesn't make sense, right? But two main components of a categorical distribution that does make sense to talk about is, number one, the mode. So here what I mean by mode is we mean the typical or the most frequent outcome, right? And then the second thing is to talk about variability, right? Or in other words, diversity in outcomes, right? We're going to explore these in more depth. Right, so the mode is simply the category that occurs the most frequently, right? So the highest bar, right, would be the most frequent. So some key differences in the mode for categorical numerical data, right? So for numerical data, the mounds do not need to be the same height, right? It's like if we have a bimodal distribution, we can have mounds that are different heights, right? But when we talk about in terms of categorical data, right, we need the modes to be roughly the same height, right, in order to count those as both the mode, right? So they need to be roughly the same, right, or exactly the same, right, very close together, not a lot of separation in between. But we still use the same wording to describe, right? So we use unimodal when there's just one distinct mode. We can still use bimodal if there's two modes, right? But remember, they need to be same or very close in frequency, right? Then we can also have multimodal, which is where we have more than two modes, right? So again, these are very close in frequency. Right. So here's an example of finding the mode in categorical data. So here we have listed, so in 2012, the Pew survey asked a new group of 2,508 Americans which economic class they identified with. Right, so you can see on the left would be an example of a bar chart for my categorical data. And in this case, the mode would be the middle class, right? Because the mode is the highest bar, and that would be the middle class in this case, right? And we don't have any bars almost, very close to the same height. So this would be just one mode here, right? And if you recall from the terminology before, we would use the term unimodal, right, to describe this data set. Right. So another thing that we can look at is variability, right? So when you think of variability, you want to think about diversity in the data values, right? So here's some key things to look for. So when we have high variation, right, we have a scenario where each value is represented with about the same frequency, right? Remember, frequency means number of times observed, right? And also, we want many observations in many different categories, right? And then to describe a situation with low variation, you want a small number of values that appear a large number of times, right? Or in other words, many observations fall into a few categories, right? So you can keep these two in mind. And there is a caution here, right? So variability is more about the occurrence of many different values rather than frequencies, right? So we want a diverse group, right, if you will. So here's a variability example. So we have two different school systems, and it says the bar charts below show the ethnic composition of two schools in the Los Angeles City school system, right? So we have school A and school B, and you can see along the horizontal axis we have the ethnic origin, and along the vertical axis is percent, right? So you can see that, when comparing these two, that school A has the greater variability in ethnicity, right? They have, more people in the different categories, right? So that's one big thing to look for and notice the difference here, right? Where in school B, primarily all the students are Hispanic, right? Where in school A, it's a little more, they have more diversity.